So Peter Hill from University of Queensland. We've just done a kind of reflexive analysis of some global health policy research that we undertook. One of the interesting findings was that we penetrated well in the medical literature and the public health literature, but in worldwide abstracts for political science, our impact was almost negligible. So it's a question about who are we speaking to when we're doing this research, and how do we penetrate the discourse where action's going to be taken?
Well, we actually, I didn't show the slide because I didn't have time, but we did a co-citation analysis in our systematic review, and what we showed was exactly what you say, that people are not reading papers from other disciplines. We've been doing quite a few of these in our systematic reviews recently, and what is really interesting is that referees hate them. The reviewers are always very critical and say, why are you putting in a co-citation, or why are you looking at who's reading what? Obviously because the reviewers themselves are not reading journals from other disciplines and they find it rather embarrassing. But I think there's a real problem in all of this, that we're not getting people reading across, and it's true of global health policies. What we were looking at was liberalisation of trade, but in a whole range of areas, our work on the health effects of the financial crisis and so on. You've got psychologists and public health people and political scientists, and often the economists are out on a limb not reading anybody else's work, and it's a real problem, and you would think it's so easy to overcome with Google Scholar and with all the other means of searching for things, but people are just completely unaware. And I think part of the problem is the academic system that we're in, where you still have in many countries, the UK particularly badly, the very powerful incentives in things like the research excellence framework for not working across disciplines and for disciplinary purity. And almost if you read research from another field, you're diminishing yourself or corrupting yourself or something like that, and it's frowned upon.
That question and that response leads us quite well into our next part of this, our next and final part of the session. But before we do that, are there any other particular comments before we get into our final bit?
Well, I'd just like to ask a question, and it's particularly for you, Deb, in PACER Plus. Well, it's two questions really, but it's basically about the movement of people, the labour clauses in all of those free trade agreements. And I know on PACER Plus, both New Zealand and Australia were asked to significantly increase the number of seasonal workers, for instance, that they had. And I don't know if there's been any research on what the influence of health on health and those sorts of those parts of the agreement as well. Movement of labour.
I'm not sure about. Sorry, I'm not sure about whether there's been any research on health in terms of those types of arrangements. But I think, the better access to arrangements for seasonal workers in Australia and New Zealand has been one of the main things that the Pacific Island countries have wanted to get from PACER Plus, and that's been one of the main reasons they've stayed involved, even though many other parts of the agreement aren't very suitable for their countries. But there's a good question around whether a trade agreement is the right way to negotiate those types of arrangements. Actually, when you look at the parts of the PACER Plus text that are about seasonal workers, that they only impose non-binding commitments on Australia and New Zealand, whereas many of the other commitments for the Pacific Island countries are binding. So it may well be that the Pacific Island countries would be able to negotiate much more satisfactory arrangements outside of that context, rather than the Pacific Islands, rather than the trade agreement. As to things like working conditions and access to things that make for healthy lives, I think that's a really important question. I'm not sure I can answer it.
Could I just pick that up, because it's actually very relevant to the debate on the European Union and Brexit. The reason that many people voted to leave the European Union was that they were they were perfectly happy with free movement of goods and services and of money, but not of people. And the problem, as they saw it, was that people from the rest of Europe were coming in as they wished with the rights of European Union citizens. So they were entitled to do all sorts of things, and they essentially couldn't be stopped. And the idea was, we want to get rid of those rights. We didn't want to give them the rights that went with being an EU citizen, which is why people voted to leave the European Union. Now, the economic system in a number of countries is maintained by allowing for that free movement of goods, of services, of capital, but by blocking the movement of people. And if people are allowed to move, they're only allowed to move with work permits and with permission and so on. So there's no, they are not in control. They've got no rights that go with that. And I think this is the contradiction at the heart of all of this. If we are willing to negotiate free trade, free movement of goods and services, we should be willing to have free movement of people as well. But unfortunately, we're not prepared to do that. It's a complete hypocrisy at the heart of all of this. And it shows that all this talk about, we live in a globalized world and we need to accept it and so on. Frankly, it's not true. This is just a matter of who has the most power. And the people who have the most power are the ones who benefit from the free movement of goods and services. But not of people, because, of course, by keeping people out, particularly in low-wage economies and so on, only allowing those in that you actually want, like some of the seasonal workers, you're retaining the power.
Well, that's not a happy thought there, Martin. Right. Well, I think now we will ask you, I know this isn't billed as a workshop, but if we could just sort of have, about 10 minutes discussion and ideas from you. I want you to imagine that you're in a country with an election coming up, just a hypothetical country, and you want to put forward planks that your prospective members of Parliament are going to be asked whether they champion or not. So you're going to sort of prepare a little list of things that you don't want to see in trade agreements and things that you do want to see in trade agreements. So if you could just imagine, you've got this election coming up in October or November, later on this year sometime, and could we first of all focus perhaps on things and ideas, just if you could crystallise in your mind what you think from the discussion so far, and feel free to ask a bit of advice from our panellists, they also probably have some ideas, on what you don't want to see in trade law. If you don't volunteer, I'll have to ask our panellists up here. But really,
Well, what I don't want is pretty similar to what I do want. It's just the reverse. What pisses me off is the secrecy that is part of these agreements. And so what I would want is open and transparency about things that affect the public health of people. And so some criteria that will say this is a public health concern, it's a people's concern. So I don't want secrecy and I do want transparency.
well, that sounds a good bottom line. Eileen, you've got somebody over here.
Hi, Becky Freeman, University of Sydney. I would just say the obvious no ISDS clauses. I don't want carve-outs or exceptions or fine print. Just don't have them.
Can I say that I would like better enforcement of public health law rather than trade law? Just so if the global agreements on public health were enforceable in the same way as trade law was, then we might have more confidence.
I'm struggling to understand what the purpose of trade agreements are if it's not exploitation of a less advantaged country. So I'd like more clarity about what the purpose of trade agreements are, and I'd like to definitely state that there won't be any exploitation of disadvantaged peoples.
Yeah, I was just thinking that maybe that, this whole talk about a lot about agreement and negotiation, but none of the things that we hear has any spirit of negotiation or agreement. It's all bullying and telling, you do this or something like that. I think, and I like the idea there are some of the stuff that maybe we can do without having to do it as part of a trade agreement. And I hear a lot of talk about how the countries, rich countries, are using their power because the small countries dependent on the foreign aid. And then they give the foreign aid to help the country, and then they bring the trade. It's almost like how, the tobacco company killing their customers. You give on one hand to support the country, and on the other hand, you give them all the stuff that's killing them. And so it's not really a question, but I think there needs to be some statement or something along those lines before we, while we are talking about this trade. There's no agreement and there is no negotiation that I can hear. Thank you.
Okay. Right, well, could I phrase perhaps a question in another way, or just give another slant to it? We all belong, I hope, to the public health associations of our respective countries, so we want to have lots of this in our public health association policy statements, as well as, of course, in the World Federation. And believe me, there is quite a lot. But do you have any extra ideas as a result from our discussion about how we could use our public health associations and give ideas and strength and support to them and the World Federation? So if you've got any extra ideas of what we could do through our public health associations, and that would be really, really useful, and then I will hand the session back to our panellists for final comments and some suggestions. But first of all, any ideas on public health association policies or anything else?
Hi, I'm Renata Zanetti, and my comments are my own, not representing my organisation. But I think having a plain language guide for some of the trade terms would be very helpful. So perhaps something that I usually use is, rather than talking about data exclusivity, I call it data duplication, because essentially what you're doing is you're requiring someone else to have to redo that data unless it's in the period that has passed. So creating a plain language guide and reframing terminology that then also can be used by trade officials, but certainly can be used by public health staff. Thank you.
Hi, I was thinking just about how we can help low-income countries to resist and to negotiate more effectively, whether that's forming into more effective blocks or whether it's giving them assistance in the negotiating process and so on. I mean, that's happened in the tobacco control world to a certain degree. Places like the McCabe Centre and that help with that. I'm sure a lot of that's going on, but it seems to me that there are some pretty obvious losses here for the lower income countries, and surely that should be being exposed, and their governments should be provided, assuming that their governments have good intentions and so on, that they should be supported in being more effective at negotiating, perhaps particularly coming together in blocks so that they've got a little bit more power to resist the negotiating strategies of the rich countries.
Sure. In kind of in order by which people were making the comments, less secrecy and more transparency. Yes, that's a very good idea. We do have to bear in mind that during diplomacy and diplomatic negotiations, there are times when going behind closed doors are necessary between countries. But there's got to be a mechanism by which, as countries sort of establish and sort of come up with drafts, those drafts become public and debatable within a political forum and within a public system. They doesn't necessarily reveal all the cards that a country might hold, but at least lets people know what's happening before the leaked texts come out. I would agree that under the current ISDS system, it's not a good one to have in trade agreements. We may want to develop an international court system of a different type, but then we have to allow governments the right and citizens the right to sue corporations that violate some of the premises around health. Enforcing public health law. Really, there are two ways of doing that. The first is you write full carve-outs for all non-discriminatory public health, development, social sorts of policies that a government might put in place. And I think there is actually a move now for that to begin to happen within trade treaties. Plus, also, if you're going into a dispute panel situation, even with the flawed ISDS, what you do is you allow people with expertise in human rights, in development, in public health policy, in social policy, in fiscal policy, to essentially sit as a separate kind of group that would look at what the dispute is and sort of say, hey, wait a minute, from all these other perspectives, this particular dispute is going to take us in the wrong direction, and that the final tribunal has to make comment and make a decision about why they may not be agreeing with that other parallel process. And as far as plain language guide goes for public health, search around, you'll probably find that there are some good glossaries and some good texts available. Bottom line on that is that you have to be immersed in this literature, immersed in it for about 20 years before you can actually begin to understand what the terms actually mean. That's why there are people in academic environments to sort of try to work with public health on that respect.
Thank you for that. And Evander, do you want to any final comments? Still thinking. No? David?
I'd just like to comment on the issue about separating out public health from trade. We do have a very good organisation for making rules and laws about public health internationally. It's called WHO. WHO has got quite unique constitution. It provides for regulations and for treaties, but WHO is presently on its knees, brought to its knees by the rich countries. And one of the explicit reasons for that is to prevent it from intervening in public health and trade. So I'd like to make the point that there is a great deal that public health associations and that the World Federation could be doing to support WHO, both in terms of to support WHO's participation in these issues, both in terms of working globally, but also holding governments to account, because it's the rich country governments which are screwing WHO by refusing to increase the assessed contributions and providing extremely tightly earmarked voluntary donations, which prevents WHO from working in this kind of space. There have been some much more brutal sanctions against WHO individuals and programs for getting into this space. So the public health movement, the associations and the World Federation have got a huge challenge to enact in this area. We have quite a very good policy from the World Federation. It just requires a little bit of oomph to make it happen.
Yeah, no, I totally applaud that. Deb.
I just want to make a brief comment about what works in terms of trying to change what's in these trade agreements, what's being negotiated, and I don't think we have much time to talk about it, but I just want to leave you with an image, which is in the very final days of the TPP negotiations, the US and Australia were at loggerheads over what would be in the TPP around monopolies on biologic drugs. So the US was pushing for 8 to 12 years of clinical trial data protection, and Australia was digging in and saying we won't give away anything more than we have already, the 5 years that Australia currently has. And the negotiation, the finalisation of the negotiations was delayed for several days while they fought out this issue, our Trade Minister, Andrew Robb, and the US Trade Representative in a hotel in Atlanta. And in the final hours, Michael Moore got down from a ladder where he was pruning a tree at home and wrote a letter which we managed to get to the Trade Minister in the negotiating room. And we wrote to the Trade Representative for the Opposition and the Greens Party, and they both made statements about how they wouldn't agree to anything that would increase the cost of medicines in Australia. And Andrew Robb stood firm on that issue, and we really helped to mitigate the outcome of that agreement on biologic drugs. And I think it's the actions of people like Michael Moore who are prepared to do something about these issues, and it's all the people who went into creating that movement in not just Australia but many countries against provisions in these trade agreements that are damaging to public health. In a way, our battles have been mainly fought against the negative things in these trade agreements. And I think, Louise, you're talking in the conference about how we can actually try and change the arguments to what we want to see in these trade agreements that actually work for public health. So I think there's a lot more to do, but the public health community is getting much more involved in being actively engaged in these things, which I think is a good thing.
And before I invite Martin to sort of close things, really, by responding, I'd just like to again play a great deal. The public health community owes Deb and others in Australia a great deal for the kinds of research and advocacy that was put into the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And I have to say, coming from New Zealand, that I very much honour Jane Kelsey in New Zealand for what she did and how she was involved. But Martin.
Yeah, I'm going to begin, before I answer the question, I'm actually going to disagree with David, if I may, because I think while I fully applaud the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and clearly it was a great move, I think there is a fundamental problem with WHO because it is in some ways a legislative body. It can enact treaties and laws, but it is unique in having one member, one vote for countries as disparate in size, from China with almost 2 billion people to Pacific Islands and small states in Europe with a few thousand. And in reality, the powerful states will never give any significant power to an organization like that. So in the United Nations, there is a mechanism of two bits. There's the General Assembly and there's the Security Council, where the larger powers have retained their veto and so on. So I think there are mechanisms to do that, but just the realpolitik of it is there is never going to be a time whenever the great powers in the world are going to give all the control to a large number of very, very small countries. So we might want to look at some stage, you're right, WHO is on the verge of collapse. I think we need to look fundamentally at some major reform there. What would we want in a treaty? Well, it's actually really easy for me because, I live in the United Kingdom and I can look at what the people who support Brexit are asking for, and I want exactly the opposite from them on every count. So they want rid of a treaty, the treaties that we have, because the treaties we have underline the fact that health should be a fundamental part of all the European Union's actions. It has a Charter of Fundamental Rights. There is a social chapter which give people maternity rights and disability rights and all sorts of things like that, all the sort of rights that you would expect in a well-functioning country. So the Brexiteers want rid of all of that, and they want some sort of a free trade agreement instead. We have the European Court of Justice that has consistently ruled in favour of public health, and where it could not do because of the treaties or the legislation, it made very, very clear statements in its rulings as to what was, how it would expect a case to be brought back so that it could actually rule on public health as it did once in a case on tobacco with Germany. Well, the people who support Brexit want rid of that open, transparent court bound by treaties, bound by precedent, and they want an investor-state dispute settlement process of the ones that we have heard about there. We have a system where individuals can actually take action against corporations under European law. They want rid of that too, and I would like that. We have a situation that allows for free movement of people with rights to establish, rights to move their family, rights to get welfare benefits, rights to get all sorts of things, rights to be treated not as second-class citizens in the country to which they move, but rights as European Union citizens, and they absolutely want rid of that. So in terms of what do we want in these treaties, I think that the European Union provides a very good model for what we would like. The fact is that many of the people who are in power want exactly the opposite, and unfortunately, because they control the media, they control all sorts of other things, they're now in the ascendant. We have a problem.
Right, well, thank you very much for all your contributions. I know it's been a bit of a whiz tour of trade agreements, and for those who haven't been totally immersed in it, I do feel a bit sorry for you. All this alphabet soup and all these complicated acronyms and this idea of clones and zombie-like sort of versions of trade agreements sort of floating around, haunting the world, is confusing. But I really do invite you to engage with the issues, to read the papers, to read the presentations that we've had today. I'm sure they'll be available if we ask people nicely. I think it's a really, really important issue. It's one of the chief upstream economic and commercial determinants of health that we have. So thank you very much indeed, and thank you not just for the panellists' contributions today, but for their organisation of this panel today and this World Leadership Dialogue. So thank you very much indeed.